We're continuing our series on finding your voice. And last week we talked about commands and your commanding voice. And that was an important review, even though we've done it before. It's an important lesson to go over. And we showed how common demands are in everyday signage. I loved that a lot of you wrote in to the comments asking, well, wait a minute, Jay, you talked about several words following the infinitive, and that means one should or must, but what if you say bevakasha or na, both of which would mean please plus the infinitive? And I love people thinking that a request is the same thing as a demand. They are not the same thing. A request is to please do something, and a demand is do something. Last week was all about the do something. So an important reminder about last week's class, which of course you can see on our YouTube channel. Today we're going to continue with a topic that is, I think, super important. It's so important that if you join us on our Wednesday Cafe Oleh conversation classes, and I highly encourage all of you, especially those of you who've never done it before, or it's been a while, to do so. It's such an important topic that it actually differentiates placing you in one level versus another. And that is what's called the passive voice. The passive voice in Hebrew, hasavil, excuse me just a second. No, I had to sneeze. No, still not. Is really important in Hebrew, not just because it's built into the rudimentary, not even rudimentary, the essentials of the language, but it's something that we talked about last week and we'll continue to talk about. In Hebrew, passive voice is actually considered the better voice. Those of you who have fond memories, or maybe not so fond memories, of growing up in an English-speaking educational system, or you yourself were teachers, you know, right? You know you were either taught or you taught never to speak in the passive voice when you don't have to, right? You made sure that if someone wrote, I was told that, no, 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 don't say I was told that, say who told you to do something, right? We're taught in English that the passive voice is considered inferior. Hebrew is the diametrically opposite. In Hebrew, the passive voice is considered higher. I was going to illustrate it today by showing you the news of the day, but unfortunately today, like many days in recent past, is not the most uplifting of news pieces. And we'll get to that in a few weeks' time when we do our review of the news at any level. But to show you how many examples of the passive voice is used in everyday language, all you have to do is open up the news. Almost every headline or every first paragraph of every article is written in passive. It gives a lot of information that it may not seem like it does, or it allows the focus to be somewhere else. What we're going to do today is we're going to understand how passive works. We're going to look at a couple examples. For some of you, this may be too advanced, just like last week may be too advanced for some people. That's fine. Think of it like how we tell people, we recommend to people to turn on the news or to turn on the radio or turn on any TV show in Hebrew and just let the osmosis go through you. If it's too hard to follow along, just let it flow through you, because I promise you, as you advance in your Hebrew studies, and I know you will, each and every one of you, all 293 of you, you will get to a point where you have to learn passive. Some of you may have even learned some of the verbs we're going to look at. Okay? They're integral to advancing in Hebrew and to understand how Hebrew works in general. And this week and a couple weeks from now, we're going to be reviewing some of the slides you're going to see today. So this is also a really good preview for those of you who want to feel even more prepared to follow along, because you're going to see some of the same slides today that you will in a few weeks from now. So with that, let's get started. Just let me open up today's lesson. Okay, here we go. Okay, so just like how last week was commands in your commanding voice, this week is finding your passive voice is the name of the game. We've talked about this slide before. Like I said, you're going to see this slide in a couple weeks from now a couple times, but this is a fundamentally important slide. And this was impressed upon me almost multiple times every week, but by a friend who is studying in Ulpan here in Tel Aviv, finally got to is in an advanced level, and all of a sudden learned what I'm about to teach you on his own. And I said, I teach this in Cafe Oleh. You should join. He's actually joined in the past, but this was a great reminder of how important understanding how Hebrew is seventh grade algebra. X times Y equals XY. I know in the comments people have come after me, Jay, you could illustrate the same thing as X plus Y equals XY. Folks, just bear with my own metaphor here because I promise you, no one describes Hebrew like this. So if you want to come after me, great. That means that I explained it well enough to you that you can explain it back to me. So if you want to think of it as X plus Y, you do you. We're going with X times Y. Why am I doing X times Y? Because every Hebrew word, nouns, adjectives, and verbs alike, all three of them, the building blocks of all languages, and especially Hebrew, are comprised of two things, and only two things. One is the X. The X is what I'm going to call the sholesh, or in this case, I'm going to assign X the value sholesh. Sholesh is the root. It literally means root. Every Hebrew word has a root, usually of three letters, sometimes two, sometimes four, but almost always three. And those three letters in a specific form, in a specific order, those three letters in a specific order dictate half of the meaning of the word. We're going to look at an example in a second. And the other half of every Hebrew word, right? So if 50% is the root, the other 50% is the form. Okay? If X is the root, Y is the form. We have two words for the word form in Hebrew when it comes to Hebrew grammar. For verbs, we call it the binyan, okay? And for nouns and adjectives, we call it the mishkal. Binyan literally means a building, and mishkal means weight, W-E-I-G-H-T, not as in waiting for the bus, right? And in addition, that form can include first, second, or third person, I, we, you, he, her, and so forth. Tense, past, present, future, and now passive, and gender, right? Everything in Hebrew is gendered. Once you combine those two things together, you create a milah, a word. Every Hebrew word, noun, adjective, verb, is 50% root and 50% form. And once you're able to understand that and unpack every word that you see, you start to understand, you see the patterns and you see meanings behind meanings. And Hebrew becomes a lot more logical than perhaps you thought. And it certainly makes it a much more logical language than, let's say, English or a lot of other languages out there. Let's look at an example. This is one of the best examples. The root kaf taf bet. Kaf taf bet, right, has everything to do with writing. Okay, everything to do with writing from time immemorial, since the Hebrew language has been around. The root kaf taf bet for thousands of years has to do with writing. And like I said, in a few weeks from now, we're going to focus just on the X. We're just going to focus on roots. So you're going to see these slides again. If we take the root kaf taf bet and we plug it into the form, right, the Y here, the binyan, which is called binyan pa'al, and we turn it into an infinitive, or in Hebrew, shem poal, we get lichtov. This is a predictable and repeatable experiment. Those of you who are scientists, or you can think back to when you last took science, you know those terms, right? When you can predict and repeat and get the same results, you know you're onto something at the very least. If not, you can make an actual hypothesis that's proven. In this case, plugging in this root into a specific form, you get the following words. Okay? Lichtov, to write, right? The infinitive to write is a result of plugging together the root kaf taf bet and the form, the binyan, pa'al in shem poal, in the infinitive form. Plug it together, lichtov. Let's look at another one. Instead of looking at a verb, let's look at a noun. Kaf taf bet, our same root, right? 50% of the word that we're about to create that has everything to do with writing. And then we take the mishkal, which is the forms that we use to create nouns and adjectives. We take the one that's called miktal. Okay, miktal gives you a clue as to how you're going to pronounce this word and also what helper letters are going to be created. So if kuf tet lamed is the plugin for our root, we know that this word is going to begin with mi, right? The mem with the e vowel under it, and it's going to be followed by a silent vowel and a ah vowel. So if we plug in kaf taf bet into the form miktal, and it says yachid, so a single form of this, right? It's not plural, it's only going to be singular, excuse me. We get michtav, right? You can hear it. Miktal, michtav. It's the same form. We just plugged in the specific root to create michtav. Michtav, a letter. Letter, not a single letter in the alphabet, but a letter in which you write. Okay? That's how all nouns, verbs, and adjectives are created in Hebrew. Just like this. X times Y equals XY. Okay? Why is this important? Because we get to this guy. Okay? This is as you see, it kind of looks like a Chanukiah or menorah because it's actually not big enough to be a Chanukiah. I like to think of this as the yin and yang of the Hebrew language and thus of how we communicate. Because in Hebrew, theoretically, in principle, for every active verb, there's a passive form, right? And you see how this works. We just looked at a verb in binyan pa'al, and if I trace it around, I come to its passive form, nif'al. Active form pl, come back, and it's got a passive form pu'al. Active form hif'il, passive form huf'al. And in the middle, hitpa'el, the verbs that either are reflexive, we do something to ourselves, or what we often translate into English as to get or become. Intransitive is another word for it, right? If all these English words are too complicated for you, it's too much grammar, okay? All you need to know is look at the flow of this. For every active, there should be, in theory, a passive, and for every passive, there should be an active. Okay, that's how it works. In English, right, to do a passive verb, all we usually have to do is we conjugate the verb to be, followed by the verb we're conjugating, usually adding ed at the end. Sometimes there's no e, sometimes it's different, right? To be heard, to be told, to be spoken, right? All those are passive verbs in English. In Hebrew, it works different. It's one word. Right? Let's look at some examples. And to look at an example, we're going to look at what passive verbs are not. But we're going to look at another example of that xy equals xy, illustrated slightly different, right? Remember x, shoresh, y, form, xy word. So let's take the root samech gimel resh. Samech gimel resh has something to do with being closed, almost always, okay? The y we're going to plug it into is katul. Katul is a form, a mishkal, right? That is the past participle. What is a past participle, you may ask? A participle in English can be, just as we're talking about tonight, can be a verb, a noun, or an adjective. It's a little tricky. You'll see how it works very quickly, right? Because many of you already know the word. If we combine the form katul with the root samech gimel resh, we get the word sagul. Sagul means closed. Okay, now many of you are thinking, well, wait a minute, Jay, we're talking about the passive tonight, and you just told me that verbs that end in ed in English are often passive. They can be, right? But this is a past participle. This is why it's important to understand the difference between active and passive, but also what is a participle, because this can get you tricked up very quickly. And I see it's a little big here, so let me see if I can make it bigger or smaller. Don't worry, you're going to get a copy of this. So if it's cut off on your screen, don't worry, you're going to get a copy of this as well. But let's go through it together. Okay, let me put that down here so I can see. And we're going to move this down as well so I can see. Okay, so at the top of the screen, right? at the top of the screen, we have the verb, our same root. All of what we're doing right now is our root samech gimel resh, right? You see in the blue, the light blue, the first column on the left and the third column, those are all what we would call active. Let's look at first the active verb, sogeret, right? In English, we would translate that as close or closes or is closing. He sogeret et hadelet hakveda. She closes the heavy door, or she is closing the heavy door. Okay? That is an active verb. Why? Because she is doing the action, right? The subject is closing the object. The subject here is he, she, and the object is et hadelet, the door. It's specifically et hadelet akveda, the heavy door, but you get the idea. What if I were to say this passive? Okay. Passive, this verb, as you saw, right, in our menorah here, right? Pa'al, is active, and its passive form is called nif'al. In this case, passive would become nisgeret. It is closed or gets closed. So look at the sentence. Hadelet hakveda nisgeret al yedei ha'isha. The heavy door is closed. Hadelet hakveda, the heavy door. Nisgeret is closed al yedei ha'isha, by al yedei ha'isha, the woman. Look what the difference is in these two sentences. Okay? He sogeret et hadelet hakveda. Right? She closes the heavy door. Notice what's the subject and what's the object. The subject is he, and the object is hadelet hakveda. Okay? So by being the subject, it comes first. It's the emphasize. But right now, we only know it as he. Okay? By using the passive, first off, the object becomes the subject, right? Because we're not talking about who closed the door. We're talking about the door now, the door itself. The heavy door is closed by the woman or gets closed by the woman. Okay? Who has agency and what's being acted upon versus who is acting? In the active form, the actor is the subject. In the passive form, right, who's being acted upon is the subject. Hadelet hakveda, the heavy door. Nisgeret is closed al yedei haisha, right, by the woman. Now, I could have said hadelet hakveda nisgeret al yedeha. I could have said the heavy door is closed by her, right? Just as I could have said, Ha'isha sogeret et hadelet hakveda. I could have also said the woman closes the heavy door. Regardless of how much detail I put in, the issue here is the word order and who's the focus or what's the focus, right? Because in active, it's who's the focus, he. In passive, it's what's the focus, the door. Okay? Active and passive. Now let's look at the participles because that gives us another way to talk about active and passive. But honestly, we're going to talk more about it also helps understand the difference between nisgeret and a word you probably know, sagul or skula. Notice first off the present participle. The present participle and the active are the exact same thing. In modern Hebrew, we've talked about this a few weeks ago, and it needs to be said again. One of the important innovations or important evolutions that creates modern Hebrew as a distinct part of the Hebrew language his lineage or timeline, as you will, is the fact that in biblical Hebrew, in Talmudic Hebrew, and even in medieval Hebrew, there is no such thing as the present tense. It does not exist. What's used instead of the present tense is this thing, the present participle. Modern Hebrew came around and kept both. It carved out of the present participle the present tense, and it kept the present participle because you can say different things with it. For example, the same exact verb, The same exact word, sogeret, is both the present tense, as you saw over here, under active, and it's a participle, closing, right? For example, the sentence, Hadelet hasogeret kveda b'miuchad. The door that is closing, or the closing door, is especially heavy. Hadelet hasogeret can be translated either as the closing door or the door that is closing. Either way, it's a participle. Okay? Kveda b'miuchad is especially heavy. Kveda, heavy, b'miuchad, especially. And then look at the past participle and look at the difference in the meaning between it and the passive. Because again, both words in English get translated as closed, but they're not the same thing. Hadelet hasgura kveda. The closed door is heavy. Hadelet hasgura, the closed door, kveda, is heavy. Right? In both of these sentences, hasogeret and haskura, they're acting as adjectives. They're modifying what kind of door we're talking about so that we understand when we say that the door is heavy, we're understanding which door. Okay? That's what a participle can do, that it's carved out of a verb to create something akin to a noun and an adjective. But notice again how the passive and participle sound very similar to each other, because that's going to be important in understanding how the passive voice works. Let's look at another example. And this time, it's going to be perhaps even trickier, because as opposed to this form, this is binyan pa'al, by the way, which uses a separate form for past participle. We now have mifane, mifune, mifane, mifune. Active and present participle are the same word, and passive and past participle are the same word. How are they used defines the difference between all four of them. Let's look. Same exact scenario as in the last one, where we're taking the same exact scenario, we're translating it, or excuse me, we're using our four different ways to talk about active versus passive. Who is the subject and what is the object, and vice versa. Let's look at the first one on the left. Mifane. Mifane as an active verb means evacuate or evacuates or is evacuating. Hashoter mifane et kol hadayarim mehabinyan. The policeman, yeah, Shuter, mifane is evacuating all of the tenants et kol hadayarim mehabinyan from the building. Okay, standard active sentence. Hashoter mifane et kol hadayarim mehabinyan. We know who's doing what. We know who has agency, who's causing the thing to happen, and who is the recipient of the action. Okay, the shoter is the subject. The object is the dayarim, right? We understand the situation. Now let's look at the passive form, because the passive form tells us not only what's the focus of the sentence, but honestly, as I talked about before, think about this in the context of news. When you're reading the news, what do you care about hearing? Do you care about hearing who did the evacuation or that the people were evacuated? Chances are you're going to care more about the people being evacuated. And listen to what I just said in English, being evacuated. In English, that's passive. In Hebrew, it is as well. Habinyan mefune me dayarav al yedei hashoter. This would sound like, not would, this does sound like a news headline, right? Not just because it's a slightly higher level Hebrew, but because it's using the passive form. Habinyan, the building, mifune, is evacuated, me dayarav, from its tenants or of its tenants. Me hadayarim shelo, the building is evacuated from its tenants or of its tenants, al yedei, by hashoter, the policeman. Okay. Again, if we're reading the news, what do we care about? Do we care about the policeman who did it, or do we care that the people who lived in the building were evacuated? Chances are, based on how Israeli news is covered, you're going to care about the building being evacuated, less so than the one policeman, at least at first, to know that thank God the building was evacuated. And then we can find out who did it. But let's find out first that the building was evacuated, right? The word order is important to understand what are we trying to get out of this and the information that's relevant. Let's look at the present participle again. Same word, but used differently. In this case, mifaneh is not evacuates or evacuating. We're talking about the evacuating policeman. השוטר המפנה דפק על כל דלת בבניין כדי לפנות את הדיירים. The moment we change how this word is used, we get more information. It's not priority of information this time, it's now additional information. השוטר המפנה, the evacuating policeman, דפק על כל דלת בבניין. דפק is knocked on every door in the building, על כל דלת בבניין, כדי, in order to, לפנות את הדיירים. Here's our verb, now in the infinitive form, in order to evacuate all the tenants. Okay? And now let's look at the past participle, because this word you probably know. If you paid attention to the news in the last 2 years, you know the word mifune. Mifune is someone who's evacuated, the evacuee. Okay, and the fancy word in English is evacuee, but we often say the evacuated, right? המפונה ביקש מהשוטר שיעזור לו תוך כדי הפינוי. Again, sounds like the news, because who's the focus? Not the shoter, it's the evacuee. It's the person who's suffering from whatever the reason is they need to evacuate their home. המפונה, the evacuated, ביקש מהשוטר, requested from the policeman, שיעזור לו, that the policeman will help him, the evacuee, the evacuated, תוך כדי, in the course of, הפינוי, the evacuation. Okay? All 4 of these sentences are the exact same scenario, and each one, we're either getting a reshuffling of priority or more details. In active and passive, we're getting a reshuffle of priority. In the active, we're finding out who has agency, and passive, we're finding out who's the recipient of that agency. In the present and past participle, we're getting more details because we've taken the verb and we've plugged it in as an adjective. So we no longer have to spend our time describing the action of the person. We can assume what they're doing and add even more detail, right? In this case, השוטר המפנה דפק על הדלת, על כל דלת. The evacuating policeman knocked on every door. We got so much more information just by switching that verb into the participle. And here, המפונה ביקש מהשוטר שיעזור לו, right? We got even more information about the person who's the recipient of it as well. It's not just that they were evacuated. הוא ביקש מהשוטר. He opened his mouth and asked for something. Okay? So 4 different sentences using the exact same scenario, using a slightly different version of each verb. Common prepositions following passive verbs, and I'm going to show you some of the declensions, some of the conjugations of these verbs shortly once we're done with these slides. Okay. As you saw in these sentences, al yadeh. Al yadeh means by or by means of, and often in Hebrew it's abbreviated to ayin gilshaim yud. Those 2 apostrophes are called gilshaim yud, or be'emtsaut, by means of or via, or a word that some of you may already know, bizchut. But bizchut in modern Hebrew means thanks to, right? We also have the word hodot. That is a very formal word. Bizchut is thanks to, by merit of, is another way to translate it, but bizchut, thanks to. Okay. Here are some notable exceptions before we look at some declensions of how these verbs get conjugated, because that's always going to be important. Even though we don't do just um, go straight through a conjugation table, I'll at least show you in one of our favorite resources how to find it out. So let's look at some exceptions. And I call these exceptions because these are verbs that don't necessarily work as passive voice, either because they're conjugated in the passive form, but they aren't used that way, or the reverse, that actually they're in an active form, but we translate them in the passive. Let's look at the verb lehikanes, a verb you learned very early on in your Hebrew language education. Lehikanes means to enter. It is binyan nif'al. If you remember that chart, that diagram I showed you at the beginning, nif'al is a passive form, right? But lehikanes in modern Hebrew is treated like an active verb. For example, nichnasti latafkid shel menahel lifnei kishana. I entered the role of director about a year ago, right? I could write something even more simple than that. כשחזרתי הביתה, when I got home, נכנסתי למטבח. I entered the kitchen. Right? To enter is an active act, right? I entered the role. I entered the kitchen. Okay, lehikanes is treated as such, even though its form is passive. Let's look at this interesting verb, leheasot. Leheasot is the passive form of the verb laasot. Laasot means to do or to make, right? So leheasot is theoretically its passive form, to be done, to be made, right? And sometimes it is translated as to be done, but it also means to become. Hanezek naasa bilti hafich. The damage became irreversible. Okay? Again, could be straight from a headline from the news, because that's how the language is used. Hanezek ne'asa bilti hafich. The damage became irreversible. Let's look at the verb leshamesh. Many of you know the verb lehishtamesh, right? Lehishtamesh means to use. Guess what? To be used is lishamesh. But that's binyan PL. That is not a passive form. That is an active form. For example, החדר הנוסף משמש כמשרד ביתי, or even החדר הנוסף משמש משרד ביתי. The extra room, החדר הנוסף, משמש is used כמשרד ביתי, as a home office. Okay, we translate it as passive, and you notice what is the word order. There's no person involved. It's not saying I use the extra room as a home office, right? It's the extra room is used as a home office, okay? Or the home office uses the extra room. Another way we could say that, but no, talking about mishamesh ke. And then one you're going to hear a lot, midubal. Midubal again is passive. It's binyan pu'al, and if it sounds familiar, is because it's meant to be the passive form of the verb midaber. Midaber, speak, say. Midubal gets translated better as it's or we're talking about, as in מדובר במקרה יוצא דופן. מעולם לא חוויתי דבר כזה. Okay? We're talking about an extraordinary instance. Midubal be, we're talking about mikre yotze dofen, an extraordinary instance. Meolam lo chaviti davar kaze. I've never experienced something like this. Right? Again, what's the focus? We get to the point of I never experienced anything like this, but the first part is the mikre yotze dofen, the extraordinary instance. Okay, let me show you in the time that we have remaining before I get to your questions, some basic conjugation of some of these verbs. Now, first off, the other thing that's important to know is another reason to join us on Wednesdays for Cafe Oleh conversations. Why? Because we're going to be practicing this back and forth between active and passive. For those of you at beginner and intermediate level, you're going to be practicing translating a sentence together from passive to active, right? I'm going to give you a sentence. You're going to figure out what the verb is in passive. And just like I showed you, which one's related to what, you're going to flip the script, as we say in English. You're going to flip the script and turn the sentence from passive to active. Okay? You're actually going to do that in all the levels. The more advanced levels are going to have a little bit more to do. Okay? But let's look at a verb table so you can see what I'm talking about here. Let's take the verb, let's do לדבר. All right? And instead of clicking here on לדבר, to speak, we're going to click on the root, Dalet Bet Resh. Right? And you see there are 16 words, and you have here nouns, you have verbs, you have all sorts of things. What I want to show you is diber, or let's find actually, do we have it here? No. Let's look at לדבר. Okay, to speak or to talk. You'll notice, right, as I told you, that one of the innovations in modern Hebrew is that the present tense is the same as the participle. So you see that both are listed here together. And it says here active forms binyan PL, right? Because it's an active verb, to speak, to tell. And then scroll down, passive forms, binyan pu'al. And here it's going to give you the entire declension of the verb, present tense and participle. Remember, I told you, same thing. Medubar, that word we just learned, meduberet, medubarim, medubarot. And because I showed you a lot of verbs today in the present tense, let's also see the past tense. Dubarti, I was spoken. Now, obviously, that's a verb that you're rarely going to use, but we just talked about something is spoken about. Dubar, it was spoken about. Dubra, it was spoken about feminine. Dubru, they were spoken about, plural. Okay. And you can do this in the future tense. It will be spoken about. Yedubar, tidubar, yedabru. Okay. Important to understand that that diagram is really important, that yin and yang of Hebrew language, that in principle, every active verb has a passive form and every passive form has an active form. Okay, as you see here, it's listed under the same thing under lidabir. It's not even separated out. You get to the active and then you get to the passive. Okay. With that, I want to stop here because that's a lot of information and that's a lot of grammar thrown at you at once. And I see we have a couple questions in the Q&A. Again, highly recommend joining us for Cafe Oleh Conversation, where you're actually going to be able to practice using these verbs and see how they work together with the active form and how you're able to add more information and focus and change the focus of the conversation. Miktal is the type of mishkal in this case, correct? Yes. In modern Hebrew, let me show you again our thing. A very important thing for those of you who are learning Hebrew or about to start learning Hebrew formally. In Hebrew, there are modern Hebrew, there are 7 binyanim. You see here, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. And we talked about that every Hebrew word is comprised of two things, right? A shoresh and a binyan or a mishkal. So I just showed you the 7 binyanim, right? There are 7 binyanim in modern Hebrew. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of mishkalim in modern Hebrew. So much so that when a native Hebrew speaker, an Israeli, is learning Hebrew in high school, because they have to learn, obviously take language just like you took. If you're a native English speaker, you took language arts or whatever you called it in your school, right? You learn the big mishkalim, the big ones, meaning ones that are commonly used. You won't learn all of them because there are dozens and dozens and dozens of them. We're going to do a whole lesson on the mishkal in a few weeks from now, and I'm going to show you a whole bunch of those, right? But we do not teach mishkalim actively, active and passive. And binyanim, we often don't teach until an advanced level, which I think is a shame because it helps underscore the mathematic logic and thus beauty of Hebrew, to understand it earlier than later, to focus on patterns. Also, because the human brain loves patterns. We love patterns. We love seeing patterns. Patterns give us order in the cosmos, right? Order out of the chaos, or cosmos in the chaos. However you want to say it, we love patterns, right? The problem is whether it's 7 binyanim or dozens of mishkalim, we don't learn them, at least early enough to make it clear. So I hope this is helping a little bit. But yes, miktal is a mishkal. Katul, we also saw as a mishkal. We have other ones that we've talked about before, as in katelet, which has to do with diseases, or miktala, which has to do with a place, or maktelet, or maktela, which is usually a tool of some kind. Katil is an adjective that's akin to able or ibble in English. We have a lot of mishkalim. Okay, more questions. You say pa'al, I said kal, they're the same thing. Binyan pa'al is also known as binyan kal. I say pa'al because the names of the binyanim also give you a clue as to how they're conjugated. So binyan pa'al gives you a clue as to how those verbs are conjugated. I learned the simple passive from the announcement in the elevators and the light rail. The lady's recording keeps telling us Adelet niskeret. If you take the light rail in the Tel Aviv metro area and you get in the elevator, right? The elevator is very specific on orders. It'll tell you everything that's happening. And the announcement in a woman's voice will say, Hadelet nisgeret. The door is being closed. It's not the door is closing. The door is being closed. Hadelet nizgeret. Nizgeret, remember we saw here, was the example I showed, is closed or is being closed. Okay? The passive was the building is evacuated of its tenants. Isn't it more logical to express this idea as the tenants are evacuated from the building? Either way, by the way, those are two great sentences, and they're both going to use the passive. Habinyan mefune midayarav, right? The building is evacuated of its tenants. Or you could say hadayarim mifunim mehabinyan. Both of them, however, it doesn't matter because they're both using the passive tense. So I love that sentence. The tenants are evacuated from the building. But again, they're both using the passive tense. Can you say medabrim al davar yotze dofen instead of medubar? No, you're going to say medubar be davar yotze, medubar al yotze davar yotze dofen. That is considered higher form Hebrew, because again, you're using the passive voice, not the active. Okay? It seems that the passive tense is less personal. That's a way to think about it. Again, because the focus is on the thing that's being acted upon, not the person acting. So that does make sense. Is there any site where you can see all the mishkalim laid out? No. I have done a lot of research on this because I think it's fundamental to understanding Hebrew. There is no one source of all the mishkalim. Certainly that's taught. There is a Wikipedia article in Hebrew that lists many of them, but it is not exhaustive. And even the National Ministry of Education's curriculum on it is not exhaustive of all the mishkalim. So there is no one site. I'm going to show it to you when we talk about mishkalim in a few weeks from now, to show you just how many there are, but also show you how lacking the education part is on this. How would you say the door is closing. So this is an interesting question, right? Because as we just talked about, and isn't that interesting? By the way, the question before, right? How in the light rail here in the Tel Aviv metro area, when the elevator doors are closing, in English, look in how I just said it, the doors are closing. If you're in North America, I can think about this going in many public transit systems in North America. Please stand back, the doors are closing. That's how we say it in English, because remember, we prefer the active form in English. In Hebrew, right, it's hadelet nizgeret. The doors are being closed, or the door is being closed. The door is closed. The door is in the action of being closed, right? It's not anachnu sogrim et hadelet or hadelet sogeret. Hadelet sogeret is actually wrong in Hebrew, right? Because that would mean that the door is closing on something. The door is the one with agency. That's not what we're saying with delet nizgeret. We're saying that the door is being closed. Don't try to open it up. Don't try to deal with it, right? Doesn't matter who's doing it. It's being closed. Get in or get out. That's the focus here, right? The door is closing. Yes, you could say hadelet sogeret, but again, it doesn't mean the same thing as hadelet nizgeret. Because in English, hadelet, the door is closing, is understanding. We don't need to know who's doing it. We just know that the door is closed, is about to be closed. In Hebrew, we get there much faster. We say hadelet nizgeret, the door is being closed. Yeah, that's the difference. And that's a great question because it illustrates exactly the difference between English and Hebrew in this. The doors are closing in English, hadelet nizgeret in Hebrew. The doors are closing, active English, hadelet nizgeret passive Hebrew. Okay. When talking about something broken, is reflexive verb used or is this done in the passive voice? The plate is broken or the plate broke itself. Is there a preference versus the English he, she broke the plate? Great question. Um, this is so for example, if I want to say my heart is broken, nishbar li halev. Nishbar is the passive form of the verb lishbor. Lishbor is to break. Nishbar is broken. Nishbar li halev. Listen to the words. Nishbar is referring to lev, heart, which is masculine. That's why nishbar is in the masculine. Li. The only reference to me is li. Broken to me is the heart, or broken for me is the heart. Right? In English, my heart is broken. That is passive, by the way. Even though it begins with my, the object is, excuse me, the subject is heart. My heart is broken. My is just an adjective. It would be the same thing as saying the heart is broken. We're just modifying it to say my heart is broken. We're not talking about who broke your heart or who broke my heart. It's just my heart is broken. So it's passive in English. It's also passive in Hebrew. Nishbar li halev. The plate is broken or the plate broke itself. If the plate broke itself, meaning it fell off the table, that's a different story. But if the plate is broken, hatsalachat nishberet. Okay, great question. But would you say hakera shvura or nishbar kera? This is a great question, and we didn't quite get into this. And so let me open this up again. The other difference, and this gets into the difference between the past participle and passive, and this is also the case, this is definitely the case in Hebrew, not so much in English. What's the difference between the passive and the past participle here? We talked a lot about the differences with everything, but let's look at the difference between those two. Okay. הדלת הכבדה נסגרת על ידי האישה. The heavy door is being closed by the woman. Versus הדלת הסגורה כבדה. The closed door is heavy. Notice the difference between these two sentences, folks. In the passive form of this, the door is being closed. Look at the translation, is or gets closed. It is in the process of it. It's not complete. Hadelet hakveda nizgeret al yedei haisha. The door is getting closed, or the door is being closed, versus the past participle. Hadelet hasgura kveda. The heavy door, the closed door is heavy. It's now an established fact that the door is closed. It's not in the process of being closed. It's closed. It's done, right? We're using it as a modifier to get to the point that it's also heavy. So the difference between these two in modern Hebrew is that passive in the present tense is something that's in the process of happening, versus the past participle is it's a done deal. That's easier to understand when the form is in binyan pa'al, nizgeret and skura. When you get to other ones like our other example, mifune, it gets a little trickier. And then you really have to focus on context to understand at what point of the action are we? Is it still in the process or is it done? This is also a big difference in modern Hebrew versus ancient forms of Hebrew. In ancient forms of Hebrew, and you'll read this in articles online, they talk about that we didn't have past, present, and future. First off, I just explained before we didn't have present tense. It's more that verbs were defined whether they were ongoing or they were a completed action. If they were an ongoing action versus a completed action. So here's the difference, right? Ongoing, nizgeret, completed, skura. Okay, that's the difference. Great question. But sometimes the person acting is the important part. Not denying that whatsoever, folks. Not at all. However, when they're not, right, when we care more about the people being evacuated or the building being evacuated versus the one policeman, we have the ability to change the order of the sentence. So how do you say we broke your heart? Shavalnu et halev shelcha. The verb lishbol, let's look it up. Let's actually look it up ourselves. Right? Just as we looked up lidaber, let's look up lishbol. Lishbol. Right? Lishbol, to break, to shatter. Okay? If we look up lishbol, to break, to shatter, right? I break, it breaks, they break, so forth. Present tense participle, past tense, future tense, imperative, infinitive. And now we have to be broken, to be fractured. Nishpal, nishperet, nishparim, nishparot. I am, you are, is broken, are broken, are broken. I was broken, we were broken, I will be broken, you will be broken, they will be broken, and so forth. Okay. So this is a verb, again, just like the others, active and passive. Okay, a few more questions. Is halev nishberet acceptable? Yeah. Usually, though, you will say halev shavul, and that's the difference between the passive and the past participle. Halev nishberet, my heart is in the process of being broken. Halev shavul, the heart is broken. It's done. It's already done. The act of being broken is completed. Do we believe that there may have been a form of Balshanim in modern Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew, of linguists? We don't know that. I would imagine so. Okay. Does mishamesh also mean to serve as? Yes. Serves as or is to be used as are two ways to translate that. Yes. Okay. Okay, we are at the top of the hour. I know that was a lot of grammar. Again, a great recommendation is to join us on Wednesday because you're going to be able to play with these verbs. You're going to play with going active from passive and passive to active and understand how the sentence changes and maybe even figure out some more details as a result. You're going to have the chance to translate, also to write sentences, both individually and together. Highly recommend joining us on Wednesday. We're going to be able to play with these verbs. In the meantime, toda rabah, thank you all for joining. This class will be uploaded in the next day or so on YouTube, along with that PowerPoint presentation that you saw. And until next week, in case you don't join us on Wednesday, toda rabah. Next week's class. Next week's class, before we break, we're going to take a quick break from finding your voice because we have a couple more lessons in this segment. We're going to do a very practical and very important practical lesson, paying your bills. We're going to pick another important bill that all of us have, go through it together, and we're going to learn not only how to read your bill and how to pay your bill, we're also going to learn when it comes to bills that you can actually not necessarily haggle with, but you need to go and figure out if there's a better deal to be had. A very, very important Israeli lesson. With that, toda rabah, thank you all for joining. Hope to see you on Wednesday. If not, see you next week. And in the meantime, litraot.